So we turn now to Dante's Inferno, which is one of the great medieval texts. Now, we're in the medieval tradition now of the classical Western tradition. So it's a very important text, like Homer's Odyssey and Iliad. Dante's Inferno, which is actually part of a larger three-part trilogy called the Divine Comedy, has really served to influence the Western idea of literature and also Western concepts about the nature and condition of humanity, and of course of punishment, of hell, damnation, and redemption. Many of the images which Dante conveys through this text are very memorable and have in fact been burnt, as it were, into the subconsciousness of Western humanity. Now, the text arises within, as I said, the Middle Ages, which is within the time frame in which Dante lives. Okay, about 1200 A.D. will be around the high to late Middle Ages. So it's at least 1,000 years later in terms of its written composition, almost 2,000 years, in fact. So the Middle Ages is the period between the 5th century and the 15th century A.D., AD or ACE, meaning Anno Domini, in the year of the Lord. It begins with the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So the Western Roman Empire is finally overtaken and collapses, at least in its structure, core government. And it ends, for the most part, with the Renaissance. These are, of course, very broad divisions. No one can actually say when does it start and when does it end. We're just trying to kind of classify the different periods. It's also divided into three distinct periods: the early, the high, and the late, where I said, of course, Dante lives between the high and the late period or so, or mostly in the high, of course. Now, in order to understand Dante, it's necessary to get some grasp of the framework within which he is working, which is, of course, Western Christianity, a history of biblical literature, and of course the cultural heritage and political events that are taking place during his time while he is living within Florence, Italy, which is basically within Western Europe. Now, I start with this passage here, which is from the Gospel of John in the New Testament. And let's read this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Now, when we look at this passage, I think within the context of present day civilization, and our Western education, well, I think we already have a basis for interpreting it. But if you imagine being handed this Bible maybe a few years after this passage, rather, from the Gospel, a few years after it's written, you turn to the New Testament passage of the Gospel of John, you open it up, and you start to read from the beginning of it, and it says, in the beginning of the Word was the Word. I think you would be a bit confused, and you'd say, well, what does word mean here? And so what you have to do is you'd have to read through the entire gospel, the New Testament, in fact, to understand that the word is likely referring to Christ or to the Holy Spirit, and certainly to some relationship between the two, and including the entire Trinitarian structure, which includes the Father. So, but this, of course, has to be gained through a history of interpretation where we've come to understand that this is the meaning of it. Certainly, just reading this passage, you will not be able to obtain and to understand that obtain a sense for understanding that this was really what was meant. Recognizing these difficulties, the early medieval scholars slowly developed what amounted to four different senses for interpreting the Bible. They divided it into two main senses, the literal and the spiritual sense. The idea here is that, well, God's word, as written in the Bible, can have multiple senses because God himself, being certainly an omniscient, all-knowing being, can mean things in more than one way. Uh, so let's take a look at these different senses. Much of them were, in fact, developed by the early Christian scholars, as I note, for example, Augustine of Hippo. He was a bishop during about 350 AD in Egypt, and he writes in his On Christian Doctrine, and he starts to develop these senses. They get further developed in later medieval thought, and they're used as a basis for offering various perspectives for interpreting the text. Now, the literal sense just sort of takes words at face value. In other words, how we usually think the words mean, how we define the words in a dictionary, how the word is used in our social standard sense. So going back to the text, we see that in the beginning was the Word. A literal interpretation would say, well, this is just literally the Word of God. God speaks, and from the beginning, and his spoken word sort of has this eternal side to it, but it's just God speaking. And of course, we see that God creates through his word. That's in the Genesis text. But literally speaking, that's not our concern at the moment. Literally speaking, it's just God's word. Turning to the spiritual senses, we have the allegorical. And the allegorical can be divided into two aspects. We have metaphorical meaning, and we have a kind of relational meaning. Metaphorically, the allegorical sense wants to look at this notion of the word and say, well, what does the word point to as a symbol? What does it represent? And here we could say, through the reading of the New Testament and the Old Testament together, we can say it points to Christ. Christ is the Word who is in the beginning. Christ is the Word who has been made. In the beginning, he was in life, and he was through God as our redemptive end. The relational meaning here, which is also metaphorical, is to see this notion, which is from the New Testament, from the Gospel of John, and relate it back to an Old Testament meaning. And so we see something metaphorical is drawn out by that parallel relation. For example, we see in the Genesis text that God creates the world, and he speaks, and the world is created. Here we see that God's word is once again announced, and within a different context, but it draws a parallel back to the Old Testament. Okay, so here again, the metaphorical, the relational senses as well. The next one is the moral sense, and in this, with the moral sense, we're trying to determine the way in which the biblical text points to how the human being is improved from the perspective of their redemptive end in Christ. And so looking to the moral sense, we see that in him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. Here, the idea is that Christ is brought into the world in order to redeem us from our sins. And this points to the need of the human being for contrition, for repentance from their sins, and it points to the aspect of God's mercy, since he lowers himself to become a human being so that we can be redeemed through him. And finally, we have the anagogical sense. And notice that word is tied here to eschatological. And eschatos means last, where logos is the study of, or the word, it means as well. It can mean word. And the eschatological or anagogical sense points to the eternal aim or end of humanity as professed within the biblical text. So this is a little different, because here we would look at the text and say, well, how does this point to the eternal end of the human being in terms of God's plan? And we see, well, Christ is the Word. We see the metaphorical notion. We see that the moral meaning points to the fact that Christ has come for our sins. And then we have the anagogical meaning, would be Well, that in coming to redeem us from our sins, the anagogical or eschatological end is that we should be redeemed and that we should be brought back to God, and so we would have this kind of eternal bliss with God, this notion of heaven. So these are the four different senses we have, and they serve as a basis for interpreting not only biblical texts, but in fact, later thinkers and even philosophers and theologians start to apply this to the interpretation of such things as historical events, literary works, philosophical works, and indeed, as we discuss Homer's Odyssey, and as we discussed Homer's Odyssey, and as we discuss Dante's Inferno, you're going to see that there are multiple ways in which we can interpret the text, some being moral, some being allegorical. Anagogical won't really enter in, but they all kind of come to play in discussing Dante's Inferno, as there are many different symbols that he makes use of in the various scenes that he portrays. So, some other terms, an allegory, this is now a different, we're using this term differently. And to speak of an allegory as a noun, we say it's a story using symbols that conveys a metaphorical meaning. I give here the example of Plato's allegory of the cave. Another example would be Dante's Inferno, the Divine Comedy, which we are actually going to be looking at. Plato's allegory is about the ascent of a man who has been bound in a cave since childhood to the surface, where he becomes astounded and amazed at the surface because he never has seen real animals and real things. And it's a metaphor for knowledge, for the ascent from just sort of dwelling upon appearances, for example, the appearances of real life on TV, and then starting to think about, well, what is the real life? What is reality? What is truth? And so that's a kind of allegory. Dante's Inferno will be an allegory in a similar sense. We have metaphor, is a word or figure of speech that conveys a non-literal meaning. Homer often uses metaphors in his caricatures. So he says, for example, he portrays the dawn as rosy-fingered. You see, that's a metaphor for the dawn, for the beauty of the dawn, that color of the dawn. A simile is a comparison of one thing with another of a different kind, often using like or as. He was as sly as a fox. We're going to see a lot of this usage within Dante as he speaks about the types of punishments and the way in which the different souls suffer on account of these punishments. He'll say that they were like this in their punishment and suffering. An allusion is an expression meant to call something in mind without directly referencing it. There will actually be a lot of allusions to real individuals and events that Dante will use in his text when he speaks of the different souls and their punishments and the different things that the damned souls will say about individuals who live within during Dante's time, Florence, Italy. Some of the allusions we'll never know because we just didn't live during that age of the Florentine, really, that time. But some of them we can kind of pick up and talk about. So here's an allusion. She was a regular Einstein. This is, in this case, an allusion to her scientific aptitude through an historical figure. And finally, an icon is a person or thing having symbolic meaning or being symbolic of something. We're going to see a lot of icons in Dante's Inferno, and the cross being a symbol is a type of icon in this sense. Now, Dante Alighieri lived 1265 to 1321. He's a medieval poet, as obviously. He is usually called the father of the Italian language, and this is said of him not because he was the first one to write, the first one to use Italian, but he was the first one to write great literature in Italian, so the vernacular Italian. So all great literature, philosophy, science, poetry, etc. was before that time written in Latin. Dante decided, I'm going to use my own vernacular Italian, and in doing so, because the work became so famous, others follow in suit and start to write in their own language. And so the Latin language actually, perhaps on account of this, or perhaps mainly because, well, this was already occurring, starts to fall out as the main language of use. So you have to think of it in terms of contemporary times. In many ways, certainly within the West, English is the main language, for example, of science and communication, even of literature, of film, certainly. You can imagine that suddenly books start to come out in very large scale in a different language, such that in order to actually read those books, you would have to now start to learn that other language, or even if you wanted, let's say, to enter into business, perhaps now English falls out as the main language, you would have to learn that other language. So Latin was the main language of the time. Dante decides to write in Italian. It became, of course, he was able to express himself more powerfully in that language, which probably led to that. But in any case, he's usually called that father. And his depictions of hell, purgatory, which is kind of the midway between heaven and hell, inspires large bodies of art, religious literature, and religious ideals, and generally our conception of hell, when we see it as this place of fire and brimstone, really owes itself to Dante's ideal and idea of it, which of course he inherits from the medieval tradition and the literature which he himself has read. So the Divine Comedy from Commedia is a work of narrative poetry. It's an allegory, as Plato's cave allegory is, because it's the allegory which is metaphorically depicts or symbolizes the journey of the soul from sin to salvation. So it's not just about, literally speaking, a man descending into hell and then ascending into heaven with his full body, okay, not having died. It's a story which depicts the movement from a life of sin and temptation to living a holy life. And this is kind of what Dante's idea is about it. And so that's why you should really, after reading Dante's Inferno, I would suggest you continue onward to read the Purgatory and the Heaven. So the comedy leads to an optimistic end, the commedia, which is why it's called a comedy and not a tragedy, because it leads to salvation. So if Dante had left it there, for example, if he had written only in the Inferno and written about how a man descends into hell and never leaves, then certainly it would have been tragic, but it's not. He goes through hell and he finally arrives to heaven and salvation. So the power of the work, it's very dramatic, it's very pictorial and visual. There's these great visual metaphors that he uses, and the depiction of the scenes are extremely memorable, and they kind of imprint these images upon the mind. And so this leaves this very deep visual power upon the work, which leads to its influence. It's also beautifully written in the Italian vernacular of Dante's time. So it's divided into 34 cantos. So a cantos in this case will be a chapter, and the canti is the Italian plural. It's actually that it should be canti because it's plural in Italian. And the canto comes from the Italian canere, or in modern Italian cantare, which means to sing. So you see that each chapter, just like Homer, who originally was this sort of singing bard or poet, Dante wants to put it in the context of being this song, because poetry indeed has this rhythm which links it to music in this way. So it's not only poetry. It's also a work which contains what we could call the humanistic tradition and the human sciences in the broadest sense. There's philosophy in it, there's theology, there's historical, he talks about historical events, and he places it within the context of his discussions with the damned souls while he travels through hell. There's also some politics in it. He places individuals within hell who have lived and died during his time. Now that's quite controversial, some of whom are in fact poets, and popes rather, and also some famous poets. So, and you have to think that during that time the church, in this case the Roman Catholic Church of that era, the Roman medieval church would be the better way of stating it, was really a political power and was deeply embedded in the affairs of the state at the time. So we don't have this deep separation between church and state during that time. Rather, church and state are deeply wed during the medieval ages and the Middle Ages. And so there's this, let's say, any type of political structure is going to have its opposites, just as we see today in the liberal and conservative. And during Dante's time, we have these liberal and conservative parties, and Dante will certainly be part of one of these parties. And as some of the popes, in this case, don't really represent his views so well, and he places them and some other individuals from other of the parties in hell, because they're certainly his opposition. And you can imagine reading that during that time, and being part of each of these parties, it would have had a very powerful impact upon you, just as if we were to take something like a modern-day president of the United States and place them in a new account of the Inferno at some level in hell. You see, it's sort of the same thing. So there's also religious elements. As I've said, the work has led to a powerful conception of the afterlife, especially the notion of hell. Here's just a sort of a medieval depiction on a mosaic of hell, of the Inferno, and you'll see that there's the earth, and then we get to the Middle Earth area, which becomes kind of the Greek underworld, and then we get to Tartarus, which becomes that deep descent. So Dante's Inferno is really that Tartarus of the original ancient Greek underworld, and it's really represented by 9 concentric circles, and so the different souls are seated on each of these circles, and as you descend further and further, the punishments and the sins get worse and worse. So the first part, which is the Inferno, because as I said, it's a trilogy, is about hell, and it's about a katavasis, the descent into the underworld. As I said, it's metaphorical in this sense, or allegorical, and hell has 9 concentric circles, which gets more grievous and terrible. Now, as Dante encounters these souls, they will be in different parts of hell, suffering different types of punishments in relation to the type of sin which they have kind of incurred. Now, the word contrapasso is used to describe the way in which Dante pairs up the punishment with the sin. We have then, for example, that this word is from contra, and patior means to suffer the opposite. And so what we see, and you'll see this as you read, that the punishments will certainly suit the crime of the condemned, either by some resemblance to the actual punishment itself, and we'll see when we talk about this, or by some contrast, some opposition to the punishment. And this is the contrapasso, to suffer the opposite. So it's not just the opposite, but this is used to speak of how he describes the punishments in any case. It's also by resemblance or by some kind of comparison as well. So in his depiction of hell, it will have been very nice, because we will have already seen the ancient Greek idea of hell within certainly the Odyssey, but he draws upon these themes from ancient Rome and Roman literature and the great poets such as Homer and such as Virgil's Aeneid, and he uses the themes that were from these texts, such as the fact that, well, hell is under the earth, and there's rivers in hell, and there's a boatman, etc., and there's a gate to hell. And so all of this will be, in some sense, familiar to us. Now, let's get into that opening and very famous first line of the Inferno. And he says here, midway through our life's journey, I went astray from the straight road, la diritta via, and awoke to find myself in a dark wood, selva oscura. So, la diritta via here literally means the direct or just road of life. Okay? So, interpreting this, okay, we can of course read this as a literal poem, and then in doing so we just say, well, it's a nice work of fiction. But this is really not Dante's intention. Certainly he wants it to be read as poetry and as fiction, and he wants you to enjoy reading it, and so he certainly put a lot of effort into that. But he also wants you to see the allegorical idea behind it, that Now Dante is speaking of himself. He's featured as one of the main characters, as really the main character in the work. Um, and he's saying that at some point in life, I woke up, and certainly midway through life, so about 40 years old, I woke up and I realized that I was living a life of sin and darkness, you see? And this is what he's saying, that I had steered away from the direct path, the just path, and now I have found myself in a dark forest. Okay? And here's a depiction by Gustave Doré. He has these famous etchings of the Inferno. And here's one example of him. There's Dante having awoken within that forest of sin. That's really what the forest is depicting here. And so the selva oscura, the dark wood, interestingly, Virgil speaks of this same forest in the entrance to his underworld, so he's sort of borrowing that from Virgil. And so we can give a couple of interpretations of it. First of all, the dark forest, notice it's dark, and there's this forest, there's weeds, and there's bushes, and so it's difficult to get by. Maybe there's insects, and there's various animals and bats, etc. It's this confusion. Why? Because you can't see through the wood, for one thing, and in many cases, if you get lost in woods, you don't know which direction you're going, especially if it's extremely dark, right? So it's this confusion of sin that one has lost clear sight. And so it obscures not only our desire, the straight path of desire, because we should desire the right things, but also it obscures our rational ability to see the truth and so to make the right choices. And this is a very important interrelation within the medieval context of the notion of the human soul and the human being. The human being is composed of this rational and irrational part. The rational, let's say the irrational rather, sort of gives the desire to the rational, and the rational kind of guides that desire to its rightful end through thinking and thought. So another interpretation here is this medieval romances, which had become very famous, started to gain traction and became something of a kind of a thing during his time. And what we see is that in these medieval romances, for example, the Arthurian legends, the legends of King Arthur and his knights, they often get lost in these forests, and the forests are often places of evil. We have robbers, and we have certain monsters and demons, etc. And so this is kind of what Dante's thinking. So also the forest becomes this depiction of unformed matter. I'll talk about this in the next slide here, of chaotic matter, of matter without any kind of structure to it. So if you look out in the world and you see any kind of material thing, all the way down to the microscopic level, you see that everything has a certain structure. So it's either a proton or electron, or it's a photon of light, or it's a person, or it's an animal, or it's some sort of an amoeba, or it's a molecular structure, and so on. But there's never just matter, unformed. You see, there's always something structural. So unformed matter is just pure chaos, matter without any kind of form. You see that? With any kind of structure, without any kind of reason or rational element in it, even if it's a naturally rational element, some sort of information structure. And so pure evil, this goes back all the way to a deep tradition, which comes from, for example, the Manichaeans in Roman times, where you have these two principles of the universe, one being the good and the other being the evil. It's kind of like the Tao, where you have this opposition, and at the very bottom of it we have evil, at the very top we have the good, and they kind of live in union. This is certainly not the Christian view. It was a kind of heresy that had to be fought off during the early Christian church, which St. Augustine of Hippo was involved in. But it still kind of captured the attention of the medieval literary eye, and there were also some other origins in it. But in any case, Dante's, you can certainly interpret the dark forest as this kind of prime matter, this complete lack of reason. So let's just take a look at what amounts to a kind of the medieval idea of, or the philosophical idea within the medieval times, or the Middle Times, of the human being as a composition of both what's soul, or what's called the form or structure of the person, and body, which becomes the flesh or the matter of the person. And we see that this structure also mirrors the entire medieval world, where we have God at the highest point and unformed matter or potentiality at the lowest point, and certainly pure non-being or nothingness being at the ultra lowest point. Now God becomes this perfect being, this being having all the actualities of existence. In other words, he's omnipotent, he's omnibenevolent, he's eternal, etc. And this moves down to his creations, where we have the lower spiritual beings such as the angels, which are different, and there's different species of angels. For example, there's the archangels, and there's the cherubim and the seraphim, and different types of angels, and these are all spiritual beings lacking matter. And then we have the beings that have matter, which becomes the human being, and the various animals, plants, and minerals. And notice how this is not only a sort of chain of being that leads from the perfect being or the highest being to perfect nothingness, but it's also a chain in terms of rationality to irrationality. So we see here that God is not only the light of existence, but he's also the light of truth and the light of knowledge, and that as we move down, we move into untruth and unknowledge, a lack of knowledge, into nothingness, obviously, because nothingness is something that cannot be known in any way or sense. It's also a chain of morality, because at the highest level, God is the perfect being and he's all good. And we move down to nothingness, and this is, you see, where we're getting this context of unformed matter, and the selva oscura is unformed matter, because when we get to pure nothingness, we have this kind of lack of good, we have the lack of truth, and we have the lack of being. And see here that the human being is somewhere in between the two, and through, of course, the intercession of Christ, we return back to the perfect being itself. Now, as he's moving through that forest, he encounters three beasts, and they begin to harass him. Each is an icon of a major division of hell. The leopard, who he encounters, is an icon of concupiscence, which is unrestrained desire, lust, and envy. We have the lion, who is an icon or symbol of violence and pride. And we have the she-wolf, the nastiest of them, who is the symbol of fraud, treachery, and avarice, and greed. So this is, in fact, inspired by a biblical passage from Jeremiah, where it states, "Wherefore a lion out of the wood hath slain them, a wolf in the evening hath spoiled them, a leopard watcheth for their cities. Every one that shall go out thence shall be taken, because of their transgressions are multiplied, their rebellions strengthened." So you see he's drawing from this passage, and he's serving this as beasts that harass him. And here you want to see them not only as these kind of beasts that symbol these types of sins, but they are the beasts of his own sin. And so because Dante has awoken on this path, he's awoken in a state of sin, and now realizing that he is in the state of sin, he no longer just wants to move forward and do the sins that he has done, but he wants to really take a different path. But in doing so, his sins harass him because he's become accustomed to these sins. They become habits, and so now they harass him, and they become temptations on the path to the path of sin that he wants to abstain from. And this is where we have these different icons or symbols. Now, along the path, he meets Publius Vergilius Maro, who is Virgil, the great poet of ancient Roman times, around 70 to 100 BCE, so almost 600 years or so after Homer, and certainly about 1200 years before Dante. And he appears to help Dante, who's being harassed, and he's going to lead Dante from this desperate state through hell into the knowledge of sins, unto heaven, into the knowledge of redemption. And so he's now one of the great Roman poets. He composed the Aeneid, of course, which details the journey of Aeneas, where there is also an underworld scene from the sack of Troy to the founding of Rome. And Dante will, in fact, draw many of his symbols from Virgil, but not only Homer and Ovid and other poets are featured. So Virgil, as I said, is going to guide Dante through the underworld. And interestingly, maybe Virgil has been chosen here as the guide because he already knows the way, because in the Aeneas, as noted, Aeneas makes that descent. Virgil portrays Aeneas and speaks of Aeneas as descending into the underworld, and so Virgil's a guide because he kind of has already written of the underworld and kind of knows the way. Now, he explains that a woman, Beatrice, who died around 1290, sought help for Dante. She was his muse in life. So he was infatuated with her, even though she was married. And she died, however, 3 years after they met, and I suppose it left this kind of impression upon Dante's mind. So she prays on his behalf, so she had died, and she petitions Saint Lucia, a martyr, who then petitions who he speaks of as a lady of compassion, who of course is Mary in this case, the mother of Jesus. And Beatrice later guides him through parts of purgatory and heaven. So what happens here, and we're going to see this and we can talk about this a bit, is Virgil can't enter heaven. And because of this, he needs Beatrice, a Christian, to do so. Virgil is not a Christian, he's a pagan. And so we'll have to see, well, what is Virgil's part then? Where is Virgil within the context of this whole underworld sort of narrative and allegory? So just a little more contemporary, modern picture here. This in Arbeit macht frei is work makes us free. In fact, it reads from the German. It's actually words that are written at the entrance to Auschwitz, a concentration camp in Poland, which was built during World War II, and in which millions of Jews were sort of brought by train, where most of them, many of them in fact, were killed in gas chambers, and their bodies were consumed in fires. And the smoke from the furnace would fill the night sky even, and could be smelt from miles, in fact. So why am I using this terrible picture? Because at the gates to hell, as Dante approaches with Virgil, he sees the following here, this kind of interesting comparison. Abandon hope, all ye who enter. Very famous lines, just as this has become very famous in our own times. So he approaches the gates, and he sees this written there. Now, he encounters immediately a group of sinners, the opportunists. And we have this contrapasso here in or what we could call law of symbolic retribution, or the contrapasso, which describes the state and punishment of the sinners. The opportunists, so opportunists are someone who takes advantage of every situation, right? They're neither good nor evil. And so here, they're not in hell, in fact. So they're not even allowed into hell because they're neither good nor evil. And this is very interesting. They're similar to the unburied souls in the Odyssey, the souls that did not receive a coin and so could not be taken by Charon across the sea, or across the river rather, to the other side. So they're outside of hell, just like these unburied souls. As they sought to take their own advantage, so in darkness they subsist or exist, pursuing an endless nothing. They are pursued by their own conscience, because one does bad things and one always has one's conscience there. And in this state outside of hell, not quite in hell, not quite outside in the normal world, they're pursued by wasps and hornets that sting them constantly. And their actions being morally filthy, they are in a swamp of moral filth. So this is the perfect example of that contrapasso, that sort of the passion suffering by the opposite or by resemblance, and this retribution, where retribution being a kind of vengeance, a justice for one's sins, is symbolized in this way. And we'll see that throughout the Inferno, he consistently makes use of similar types of themes. So finally, they encounter Charon, who is this old man as he is in Homer, but he has fiery eyes. And so this is a big transition. We see that in Homer, the world of the undead is not a world, in this case, of hell. It's a world where literally those who have died eventually end up, and so whether you're good or bad. Now we have that he immediately enters the inferno, enters hell, and Charon is not just this kind of, in this sort of divine figure, but he's in fact a demon, an angel, a fallen angel, and he refuses to allow them to cross. Why? Because, of course, Dante is alive, and so he doesn't belong there. Virgil has power, though, that has been given him from on high, through, of course, the intercession of Mary, the Mother of God, and so Charon is forced to consent, but all of this terrifies Dante to such an extent that he faints, only to wake up on the other side. This is, in fact, an interesting literary device, because Dante is taken to the other side into hell, and so therefore he doesn't have to actually describe the event of crossing. He can just describe the event of having now woken up. So on that note, we are taken into the next three cantos and into the Inferno with Dante into hell. As we move into it, let's talk about some of the context for Dante's understanding of sin. So within the medieval church, then, there are 7 main sins. So there's all different types of minor sins, okay, such as a white lie, for example. But there's 7 primary sins. Here we see pride, greed, wrath or anger, lust, envy and jealousy, gluttony, for example, overeating all the time, and sloth being laziness. Now, these sins will be featured within the work, and in some cases there's an interesting structure. Perhaps at the bottom level we'll see something like treachery, and that's really considered one of the worst sins by Dante, whereas lust is kind of more at the top. And it has to do with, one's level of being committed to the sin, or one's level of intentionality. We've distinguished this, for example, between first-degree murder and second-degree murder, where first-degree murder is usually something which is certainly premeditated, and so sins can be separated in terms of their punishment based upon that type of premeditation, or the level of violence involved, etc., or not. So we get to the first circle. Okay. Now remember, there are 9 circles of hell. What we've seen previously is Dante approaching hell, being at the gates of hell, seeing the opportunists, and now he is in fact in hell, and he's in what's called limbo. And limbo now, and of course he awakes there, is from limbus, meaning the hem or the border. So it is certainly in hell, but it's limbo because now what we encounter are actually damned souls, truly damned souls, who ironically led good lives. This is interesting. So, and what do we have in there? We have virtuous pagans, basically, who are virtuous non-Christians. We have unbaptized infants, and we have Greek, Roman, and Arabic heroes and poets. Now, why are they in hell, one might ask? One thing that you should note is much of Christian interpretation today would not place many of these individuals in hell. But in the medieval world, I think things were still at kind of very rudimentary, elemental, almost barbaric levels in terms of the relation between the individual to the social order. In this case, those who are in hell are those who have not received the word of Christ, and so cannot be saved. And this includes unbaptized infants, because they have not been baptized, and so they have not been brought into the church. And so the church teaching at the time was that, well, these unfortunate souls would in fact go into the underworld, whereas today, really, the notion of the mercy of God is instead emphasized. In any case, fortunately, these good souls who are in hell, they don't receive any physical punishment. All the other souls will receive some sort of physical punishment. They are, however, without hope. One could perhaps argue that this is punishment enough. But in any case, this is the types of souls that are encountered. So there, interestingly, he encounters 4 classical poets. Now remember, this is it's a literary work. It's not necessarily a religious work, because you could, of course, say, well, was Horace and Homer and Ovid, were they good men? Certainly they were good poets, but were they good and virtuous men, in the sense that even though they're pagan, they were virtuous, so certainly they belong in limbo, but why shouldn't they be placed in a deeper level of hell? Well, because for Dante, they were such great poets, so they should be at the level of limbo. Now, of course, tied into this is the idea that greatness of this sort, of literary greatness, has to be tied to a kind of clear mind that sees and understands truth and has a deeper recognition and feel for beauty. And as we saw with this sort of the chain of being, well, as we move higher in being, we get closer to goodness and truth, and of course to beauty as well. So the poet who recognizes that must at some level be beautiful in their soul to do so. In any case, he encounters these 4 poets. We have Homer, who we're familiar with. We have Horace, a Roman poet. The rest are in fact Roman. Ovid and Luke, and of course Virgil belongs to this list, because Virgil, in fact, is a damned soul who, in fact, is housed here in the first circle of hell in limbo, but now he's not listed because he serves as Dante's guide. Just as a note, Dante at some point notes that, well, they allowed me into their company, and which is a very interesting statement, because he basically says the 5 great poets of classical legend greet me, and they say, you belong with us, so obviously Dante must be a great poet as these. So there's a bit of arrogance in Dante, and you should just look out for that line. It's very interesting. So at some point, Virgil recounts certain events, that there were other individuals here, particularly the Hebrew saints, Noah, Moses, and Abraham. So this is very interesting. Before Christ rises, or actually dies on the cross and then descends into hell. This is kind of one teaching. The Hebrew saints of the Old Testament are in limbo, and Christ, when he dies on the cross, he descends into hell. This is called the harrowing of hell. To harrow is to abduct, and he steals out these Hebrew saints from, in this case, the mouth of Satan. He frees them, and so Noah, Moses, and others are freed from hell and delivered into heaven. And so he speaks of this. This event will actually have some interesting repercussions, because we see that the harrowing of hell is not only an event of removal of souls, but in descending into hell, we see that certain parts of hell collapse on account of that. And this will kind of be interesting, because Dante interprets that in his descriptions of certain parts of hell. He moves on, and he encounters in limbo the pagan philosophers, especially the master of those who knew. And this is an important title which he gives to the great Greek philosopher Aristotle, who I've spoken of, who was in the first lesson, who was a student of Plato. Why Aristotle? Because Aristotle's works were the primary philosophical source for medieval theology. And so much of medieval theology, Western medieval theology, would be built upon really what amounts to a pagan philosophy. But Aristotle was one of the great, if not the greatest, of the geniuses of classical times, of ancient times, even medieval times. There were others, but he was one of the great ones. And in fact, the medieval thinkers so respected him that they didn't even refer to him by his name usually. Within their texts, they would just call him the philosopher. By the way, they also referred to one of the great Arabic thinkers, the Christian thinkers actually referred to one of the Arabic thinkers by a similar sort of privileged epithet. This was Avicenna and Ibn Sina, and they called him the great commentator. So this is just interesting how they drew upon these pagan texts, and they also drew upon Arabic and Jewish texts. Truly, the medieval times was a time of great synthesis, one of the reasons being that during that time the Crusades were taking place, in which Western knights and some kings, in certain cases, would go as far as Jerusalem, and they would fight the Arabs who had, with their incursions, at some points overtaken certain areas. So in any case, Aristotle is referred to as the master of all who knew, and indeed the primary reason here is because his thought informs medieval thought and cannot be understood apart from it. Just as a side note, interestingly, all of his works were translated. By comparison, his teacher, Plato, was only one of his works, the Timaeus, was translated. And so a larger part of the tradition, which was part of the ancient world, was kind of lost during the medieval times. We enter then the second circle, the circle of the carnal, the lustful. And before this circle stands Minos. So he enters and he sees Minos, this great beast. And as we saw him in Homer as one of the judges, is now one of the judges of the damned, again, one of the three judges in Homer, and he basically decides upon the punishment. He has this great serpentine tail, and now as there's going to be concentric circles which lead down to the ninth and worst level, depending upon the sin which one has committed, so maybe one is lustful, but one is also wrathful and has committed murder, so one now belongs not on the level of the lustful, but actually a deeper level, the level of the wrathful, and so he'll curl his tail until he gets the number of circles that the soul must be damned, must be sent to, and he does so with pleasure, in fact, because the punishments deepen as one gets deeper. He gives an interesting description. Just here's a great example of Dante's use of language and his use of the Italian language as a poet. So it would be a great work to read, in fact, in Italian. And he speaks of Minos, in this case, as a horrible Minos, grunts there like a bull. So you think of how a bull might sound, okay? This sort of grunting noise. And he makes use of what's called an onomatopoeia, which is basically using words to sound like things. And I'll try to do to state the sentence as best as possible in the way it would be read in Italian. So he says, and think of the bull kind of ringing out with its grunts. Stavi Minos horribilmente eringia. You see that? So horribilmente eringia. So this kind of of the Minos, of the bull. And so it's beautiful because not only does he give us a visual description, but he gives us also a description which is in the form of a tone, and the tone kind of sings out to us through the literary sign in the language itself. So a great writer we see in Dante. So lust, so the lustful. So he hears cries and wails of sorrow and suffering as he passes by Minos, and the soul, these are the souls condemned through lust, and these are individuals who have made their own reason, the higher part of the individual, a slave to the lower part, the irrational, which would be a slave to desire. Their punishment is to be a wind, we see, cascades, whips through hell, and like a whip, flogs them. And you can imagine the sound of the wind as it's whipping the souls. And this is an important point, okay? They don't pray out to God for help. Rather, they hurl curses at God. Why don't they pray out to God? Because they are damned, and as damned, they have no hope. And so they cannot hope in God. It is rather only one who has hope, who in times of suffering can cry out to God for aid. But one who lacks hope altogether, because the damned are completely separated from God, do not see hope. They see only despair, and so in being punished, they don't cry out to God, they cry against God. This is a very important point to make. So he also encounters some historical figures, and there's going to be a lot of historical figures within the work, political figures too. We have Semiramis, the Assyrian queen, who is famous, apparently, this is probably not actually hers, but this pun is attributed to her. All that is libitum, pleasurable, is licit, can be done. In other words, is doable. Then there's Cleopatra, the great and famous queen of Egypt, who was the lover of Julius Caesar, as well as Mark Antony and Pompey, and unfortunately came to a terrible end at the bite and venom of a snake. We have Helen and Paris of Troy, who we should be familiar with, the two lovers. At source, he abducts Helen. Paris abducts Helen, and she eventually betrays him, but they're still the lovers at source to the Greco-Trojan War. We have Achilles, who fell in love with Polyxena, the daughter of Priam, and eventually she traps him, and Paris kills him. The great Achilles dies in this case, but he's unfortunately this great hero is sent in hell for his kind of lustful behavior. We have also Tristan, this famous Arthurian knight who was in fact a Christian, but unfortunately he betrays his Arthurian knight through lust in a way. He's sent to fetch Iseult to wed a king. Instead, they drink a love potion and become lovers instead. Not really fair because they had the love potion, so not really fair to condemn them here. But the point is that we have this tradition of literature, and Dante is drawing upon it and adding these figures here. That's certainly most of the individuals during that time who knew the literature would know these individuals. Then we have Francesca and Paolo, these two Italian individuals. They're lovers entangled in eternal suffering, and they were murdered by her husband, Giancotto. So these would have been individuals that Dante would have heard of, and that the Florentines would have also known. Just you can imagine that events of this happening on the news. Well, here he places these two individuals in hell, and they are, of course, lovers who commit adultery through lust, and so they belong here in the second level. They're murdered by her husband, crippled Giancotto. He'll later appear in the Betrayers, so he gets an even worse punishment, for betraying and murdering in Cain. Well, we see Cain betrayed his brother, for example, Abel. And they fell in love. Interestingly, they talk about this because Dante actually has a conversation with them while reading a tale of Lancelot and Guinevere, the famous Arthurian knight Lancelot, and Guinevere, the wife of King Arthur. And of course, she and Lancelot have an affair, which kind of brings the whole King Arthur's kingdom to a halt. Anyhow, they enter. What happens is that evil enters through the perversion of good. And unfortunately, through beauty, lust can prevail. And here, this is important because we see the prince of darkness, Lucifer, Satan, is in fact the angel of light. So he portrays himself in the appearance and the guise of something true and beautiful, but at heart is deception. And so they are deceived equally in reading these tales, these beautiful tales of romance. They fall in love with each other. Here, Dante faints again out of pity and sorrow. So he feels sorry for them in this case. What's interesting is that as Dante descends lower and lower into hell, you'll see that this pity, this sorrow begins to depart. And this is an important point because it's as it should be, because just as the damned no longer receive the mercy of God, so too the damned should not receive our pity and sorrow. And certainly as he descends deeper and deeper, and the hells and the sins get worse and worse, Dante seems to at some points even completely lack mercy, and even at some cases get angry at souls and inflict more punishment on them by himself. And we get into the third circle, the gluttons. Here we have this three-headed dog, Cerberus, who we saw guarding the entrance of the underworld in Homer. Well, here he guards the third circle, and he's this nasty, stupid. Now he's a demon, so he's this kind of angelic substance, the soul, but because it's a fallen soul, it lacks reason in this case, because God is the source of truth and knowledge, and now the fallen angels, in falling into the pits of hell, have lost contact with the source and have become kind of irrational and kind of, in some sense, lacking sense. And Cerberus is this kind of foaming, demonic spirit, and he guards the third circle, and Virgil throws mud and he runs to fetch, and so they're allowed to get down into the next level. So there he encounters the gluttons, and we see that the gluttons reveled in life, eating and drinking and partying, and for their punishment, excuse me, there's rain, hail, and sleet that falls ceaselessly upon them, and they lie in this filth, this kind of filth and frozen. They're frozen in suffering, and they're thick with the stench. So notice how gluttony is something that brings this kind of lethargy, this kind of static. You could think of the pond that stagnates, and so their punishment is to be kind of as the glutton that stagnates in their eating and drinking to excess. So their punishment is to be stuck in this frozen stagnation. Okay, this kind of almost like a lake of freezing rain and sleet and snow and filth. And there he sees Chiaco. So he raises his head, Chiaco, and calls out to him, and he says, "Look at me well. You may know who I am." He says, "I am Chiaco," which was his nickname, the hog at the time. So this was someone that Dante was familiar with, or the Florentines. And then, this is an important theme because it'll occur throughout Dante's Inferno. He speaks of the current political turmoil, and he offers a prophecy. And we'll see that a lot of the damned will in fact offer prophecies. Why? For the reasons that we saw in Homer, that the damned see the future. We're going to see that Dante offers a deeper interpretation of this, and we'll see this later. And he says that after a struggle long and intense, they'll come to bloodshed. And who's the they? Well, of course, we have the different opposed parties, the left and the right. And here in Dante's time, we have the Cerchi, who were like the blacks of the black flag, and the Donati of the white flag. And these are different families. And so, because what happens in Florence at the time is that Florence is basically ruled by rich families who become the main powers and main political parties. Now, unfortunately, later, the Cerchi drive the Donati family out of Florence, and Dante is expelled from his beloved city. So, being from Florence, he didn't want to live anywhere else, but he's expelled finally until his death for 20 years, here we see, from the city because of these feuds. So these feuds are a deep part of Dante's life. Dante really is a kind of patriot of one of the sides and political figure, and he doesn't suffer the worst on account of it, but he does suffer being expelled from the city, and Chiaco speaks of this feud within the book. So we see some other historical figures, because Dante will ask Chiaco about some other worthy men, and he means the political patriots of his own side, and Chiaco will say they are somewhere in the lower circles. So these famous worthy men, which is very interesting, because Dante will depict them, even in their suffering, and some of them at least, in a very worthy fashion. Farinata, for example, who we'll see in the circle of heretics, Tagaio and Jacopo in the circle of sodomites, and we have Mosco among the sowers of discord. So you see all of these individuals are going to be found at deeper and deeper levels within hell. There is then the last judgment that Virgil makes a reference to, and this is important because in the last judgment, the souls will receive a corporeal body. So within the context of the medieval philosophical worldview, something that exists, especially something which is physical, is a combination of both a form, which is non-material, okay, such as something, think about the structure of a water molecule being H2O. There's that structure, and every water molecule is H2O, and at the same time, there are different concrete water molecules that you have, for example, in your cup, right? And so, but you have all these concrete water molecules, and then you have kind of the form, the structure, which is H2O, and they all have that, right? So what's the difference? The difference is that you have the form, and then each of these individual water molecules that are in your cup have matter. Okay, they're kind of concretized in matter. The form becomes informed in mattered or in mattered. Now what happens is that anything that a human being can't exist apart from some kind of material form. So when the human being dies, They can't just exist as this kind of formal structure, which we could call kind of humanness. No, that person must be informed in a body in some way. And so they receive in hell this quasi-substantial body. Later, Dante will give it more of an expression. He'll characterize it as a body just composed of air molecules. Well, what's going to happen is that in the final judgment, they will receive a corporeal body, so they'll lose this kind of, you can almost think of it as a kind of balloon body, and they will receive a corporeal flesh and blood body, which means that in their punishments, they will suffer all the more because they're going to feel it much more deeply, and as we would feel it, as it were, feel it in the flesh. Now, to end this lesson, I just want to give you a little picture of what would have been the medieval cathedral, just a few pictures of the works, the architectural work. Here we have the Cathedral of Saint-Lazare in Burgundy, France, built around Dante's time. So he would have been familiar with structures like this, and this would have made up the basic religious structure of the Western cathedral during that time. Here's the interior of it, but what I really want to get to is this, what's called the West Portal. Here we have these doors, these portals, entryways, of the cathedral, because what you see up here in this kind of half circular structure is what's called the tympanum, which comes from Latin drum. Above the door there is this depiction of the Last Judgment, and this is important because certainly here in an instance of sculpture and architecture, but also in painting, Dante would have been very familiar with these depictions, and they would have informed Dante's vision of the horrors of hell. One also has to keep in mind that during that time there were public executions, and there was the Inquisition, in which there were torture chambers, and there was the very deeply sophisticated art of torture that was developed, and obviously people would have known the types of tortures that occurred as people told of what had happened to them. And so here's an interesting picture from that tympanum. We see the pictures of the damned being tortured. We see the various torture devices in these unfortunate state and condition which the damned are in. And so this just gives you a little sketch, a kind of what Dante would have been familiar with, and the types of sort of visual experiences that would have helped to inform his work, apart just from the kind of literary depictions of the underworld that we see from the various classical poets.